This is the first piece I've written on childhood, as it turns out. So I'm very interested in hearing both Mary's comments and the comments of the audience afterwards. Children, along with the mentally ill and prisoners in countries like the United States, are the only category of citizens disallowed from having a say in futures. That is to say, they are denied access to politics as a practice devoted by definition to making the future. But children are only the last of a number of such groups that had in the past been formally excluded from participation in political life. Not so long ago, they had kept company with slaves, women, the poor, illiterate, colonized and religious or ethnic minorities of many kinds. And the reasons why children cannot be political actors remain the same as those that had prevented all these others from doing so. It is because they are not responsible for themselves that children cannot have a say in deciding both their own future and that of others. Such tautological arguments, once deployed against women, slaves, and others, are still used to keep children out of political life. These include their congenital immaturity, ignorance, dependence on others, vulnerability to outside influence, and inability to own or control property. Yet children are also at the center of politics insofar as it claims to make a future for them and even does so in their names. They also stand in for all the others who have been denied politics by reason of their racial, civilizational, or gendered childishness. And in this way, they differ from prisoners or the mentally ill, whose temporary status is otherwise so similar to that of children without being conceptually central to political thought. Children pose a unique problem for politics since they cannot consent to making the very future they are meant to represent. The global visibility of children in contemporary public life, from the environmental activist Greta Thunberg in Sweden to the advocate for girls' education Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, may have been made possible by the internet and social media, but more importantly, it throws into relief the paradox of politics as an enterprise oriented to the future. The emergence of children into public life represents nothing more than the logical extension of politics itself as a practice in whose name universal claims have been made in modern times. Such claims were once and are still today made by women, slaves, or the colonized. But what does it mean for the future to speak for itself in the voices of children? How does their presence expose the limits of politics as a way of making this future? Childhood is not a natural, to say nothing of a biological category, one that can be decisively contrasted with adulthood. To reprise Rousseau's argument denying any difference between the physically weak and the strong, significant enough to justify the latter's political domination, we know that there will always be children more intelligent and responsible than some adults. And as demonstrated by the varying as well as changing age of sexual consent, voting, driving, or criminal responsibility the world over, childhood is also a notional and culturally defined category. It was invented in 18th century Europe as a distinct ontological and phenomenological state, rather than a ritual or legal one defined by things like bodily control, sexual activity, or the right to enter into binding contracts. For the purposes of my argument then, childhood refers not to any biological or even legal category, but serves as a rhetorical device to separate one world of action, responsibility, or experience from another. My particular concern is with the consequences of defining childhood by its inability to make a future. If children cannot participate in politics and speak for their future, adults must do so in their name and for a future they cannot share. This is why they represent children in political life as trustees, their acts meant to become altruistic, disinterested, and sacrificial in this respect at least. It is this appeal to act against their own self-interest that characterizes the familiar invocations for adults to leave a better world for their children. Departing the conventional logic that would attribute all politics to the promotion of one's own interest, such an imperative diverts modern visions of political behavior into an older narrative of pastoral care. This had also characterized trusteeship, the trusteeship that free adult males once exercised on behalf of women and slaves, as well as the poor and colonized, thus showing how children not only represent the remnants of this past, but repeatedly bring it to the fore again. If adults are asked to sacrifice their own future for that of children, this both reinforces and in fact expounds the future-oriented nature of politics, while at the same time depriving it of meaning as a form of self-interest, interest being the fundamental unit of liberal and indeed modern politics. Of course, there can and will be attempts to reconcile these two kinds of futurity, but my point is that the child's very presence as a voiceless representative of the future compels the emergence of sacrificial politics as a trope, no matter how sincere or hypocritical it may otherwise be. Normally, it is only exceptional events like wars that provide the grounds for such a sacrifice, with childhood therefore departing their narrative by reason of its quotidian character. Here, too, the child poses a significant limit to normative and liberal conceptions of political action. By entering politics as representatives of the future and thus occupying its conceptual center, children represent an adult status they have not yet achieved. They cannot, in other words, speak in their own name, but only in that of their future selves, something that globally prominent activists like Thunberg and Yousafzai routinely and deliberately do. Like the ghost of Christmas future in Charles Dickens's famous children's story, A Christmas Carol, the child in public life can only speak prospectively or spectrally from another time. There is always something of occult about such figures who often serve as mediums for other people and other worlds. They do not and indeed cannot speak for themselves, but manifest some truth of which they may not themselves be aware, as familiarly expressed by the biblical idiom, out of the mouths of babes. In the astute and amusing diary of her travels in the US and Canada in 2019, Thunberg describes how important her childhood is for adults who seek a kind of oracular wisdom and moral chastisement from her. And I quote, "That same day I'm called to testify in the US Congress, but it just feels wrong. What am I supposed to do or say there? I want the people in power to listen to the science, not to me. And the fact that the responsibility to communicate them falls on me and other children should be seen for exactly what it is, a failure beyond all imagination." Back in Europe, she is interviewed by a journalist who also expects a child's wisdom from her. Quote, "When I then start talking about carbon budgets, he gives up and interrupts. He knows very well he won't be able to use anything of what I'm now saying in his article. People want something simple and concrete, and they want me to be naive, angry, childish, and emotional. That is the story that sells and creates the most clicks. But he continues, how are we going to solve this climate issue? Just the fact that this question is asked to me, a teenager, over and over is absurd, but not as absurd as the fact that the climate and ecological emergency is being reduced to a problem that needs to be fixed." Unquote. There is another way in which children in public life become mediums, this time not for their future selves, but instead for their parents or other adults, and so the past. Child stars, among the earliest minors to lead extensive public lives without being either royal or divine personages, have become the stereotypical figures of such vampiric mediation. The desire of parents to fulfill themselves through children is one way in which the profound political suspicion of illicit influence and exploitation manifests itself, one that has been used in the past to disqualify women, the illiterate, and the unpropertied from exercising agency in politics. It is no surprise, therefore, that all children in public life are inevitably seen by their critics as speaking in the voices of adults, either as victims or willing accomplices. Mediation is an ambiguous phenomenon which calls up ghosts from the past as much as the future. But gods and monarchs surely perform the same function, their ghostly legitimacy deriving from the past, but meant to be perpetuated into a future in which they will have themselves become spirits. Like children, such divine and royal figures are held hostage by these absent temporalities, such that their role in the present becomes a kind of interlude or threshold, one that calls for some great deed if it is not to crush its subject between past and future. And this provides yet another example of the way in which the child, in its very political deprivation, nevertheless continues to possess a certain connection to power and so to pose an undefined threat to the very politics in which it apparently plays no part. Unlike women or slaves, whose politics is defined by the struggle to escape their status, children depend upon and even emphasize their lack of voice to become public figures. It is because children have no political status or voice in the present that they can serve as mediums in this way, alongside the equally voiceless animals who have traditionally functioned as occult familiars. The relationship between children and animals is based on their shared deprivation of language, which is one of the classical requirements defining humanity as much as politics. Of course, animals do not have a future in the sense that children are meant to, their status being permanent. And it is as purely present beings that they represent the conceptual limits of politics even better than children. Now, Jacques Derrida is the theorist of spectrality as a way of thinking about the time of politics. His book, Spectres of Marx, begins with the famous invocation in the Communist Manifesto of a spectre haunting Europe. Like the child who might become its medium in politics, communism for Marx and Engels was a ghost from the future. But as Derrida reminds us in his subsequent discussion of the ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet, such spectres and their demands emerge in fact from a time that is out of joint. Ghosts, in other words, represent not the past or future so much as the disruption of temporality itself, conceived as a linear progression, one whose fracturing allows different temporalities to seep into each other. And it is precisely this spectral role that children play in politics, their presence there always untimely and indicating a state of disruption. But what would it mean to set this time right, which Hamlet sees as being his cursed fate? Is the child meant to retreat to its speechless and so animal-like present by resigning the role of medium for a future self? Insofar as the visibility of children in political life signals a state of exception in some way, it by the same token ties them to the founding moments of all political regimes, which can be understood as the establishment of new ways of grasping the future. In this sense, they foretell, if not make possible, the exercise of sovereign power, whether revolutionary or reactionary, that Carl Schmitt famously described as a state of exception. And yet, as I have pointed out, children represent not simply exceptionality in politics, but also its permanent limit, if not contradiction. Their public presence thus indicates continuity as much as change. It is one thing for children to become the mediums of specters from the past or future, but how are we to describe the figure of the child itself as a ghost? For it is this possibility that children repeatedly raise in politics. They appear in public life to warn of the future's annihilation, as Greta Thunberg does so frequently when speaking about the destructive potential of climate change. And in doing so, they not only foretell the destruction of their future selves, but become their prospective ghosts in the process. This is indeed the role child ghosts play in literature, folklore, and film, defined as they are by the loss of their own futures. The child in politics is therefore haunted by the future in one way and by the past in another, while at the same time haunting the present by depriving it of meaning. This is clear in Thunberg's famous speech before the UN General Assembly in 2019, in which she speaks from and for different times as a witness to the future and its judgment upon the present. I quote, "This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of economic growth. How dare you? There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today because these numbers are too uncomfortable. And you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you." Close quote. Can the present possess political meaning without a future, or must it only have moral import of the sacrificial kind I described for adults, who are asked to act on behalf of a future they will not share? Another way in which the deprivation of a future ends up depoliticizing the present has to do with the heedless, or more properly nihilistic, concern with momentary pleasure, or rather convenience, that Greta Thunberg inveighes against. Our refusal to act against global warming, like the possibility of nuclear annihilation whose apocalypse had preceded it in the popular imagination, suggests that we have accepted our doom, or at least that of our children at some level. And yet, apart from the ever-increasing tribe of billionaires who benefit from this crisis, our pleasures are too insubstantial to justify abandoning the future in this way. Thunberg's argument is that the politics we engage in is sacrificial in the wrong way, renouncing politics itself along with the future by refusing to take it seriously. Driven by habit, convenience, and sheer incapacity, while being shoved into the maw of the global economy, our politics has become a meaningless set of superstitions about the future, or gambles on it, that are defined in purely economic terms. Against this, she suggests we have seen another kind of sacrifice for adults to engage in, yet one that is contradicted by Thunberg's simultaneous reliance on a political rationality motivated by the future. Her struggle is meant to rescue politics and so the future, though she can only do so by speaking as a child from outside its domain, while at the same time asking adults to sacrifice their own future, and so politics. The problem that the child as medium or ghost poses for politics is therefore twofold. On the one hand, children emerge in public life to speak for a threatened future which they would restore by the temporary suspension of a politics based on self-interest in the short term. In this way, they represent the exceptional moment of sovereignty in political founding. On the other hand, their advocacy of sacrifice presents a permanent and, as it were, structural threat to such a politics of the future. And this means that children stand in the way of the very sacrifice they encourage by representing the future. This is why they must suffer or sacrifice not in their own right, since they represent another time and stand outside politics, but by enacting the role that adults are expected to play in a vicarious or pedagogical performance. If it is not to become pure victimization, the suffering of children always entails their performance, or rather ghosting, of a politics that adults are otherwise meant to conduct. Malala Yousafzai not only endured an attempt on her life, but did so by taking upon herself the adult task of teaching girls as she herself would have liked to be taught. And in doing so, she short-circuited any linear relationship between past, present, and future. If a Thunberg or a Yousafzai wants to reclaim the future and so politics itself in a time that is out of joint, Their contemporaries among the teenaged jihadi brides who left Europe to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria appeared to be intent on risking, if not forsaking, theirs. Like their globally admired counterparts, these young women occupied two times and roles simultaneously, impersonating adults by embracing sexuality and violence, while yet remaining children in their apparently voluntary renunciation of political agency in the Islamic State. Like all children in public life, they were also suspected of being seduced or groomed by adults, or at least consenting to their inveiglement in a way that put their status as victims into question. Can their actions also be associated with the sacrificial ones described above, which depend not upon renouncing the present for the future in the way of ordinary politics, but rather by doing so in the latter's absence? In their own view, these jihadi brides, to use the European media's salacious term for them, might well have been rushing into adulthood by sacrificing their own present for Islam's future, which seems to be the view taken by their countries of citizenship. Shamima Begum, for instance, one of the three young women from London who in 2015 left to join ISIS in Syria, was stripped of her citizenship, though she had been a minor when departing and is not known to have broken any British law. Yet it remains her childhood and sacrifice of the future it is meant to represent that gives Shamima Begum both her media allure and a genealogy going back to the Children's Crusade. By their sexualization, jihadi brides raise the issue of gender more clearly than some of the other children in politics. This was especially true of Shamima Begum, who had three children by the militant she was married off to, each one dying as she endured the rigors of war and imprisonment. The last died while she was fighting the British government's refusal to let her return to London, even if only to face trial. Her story also reminds us of the fact that women and children are bound together more closely than they are to slaves, prisoners, the poor, and others who had once been excluded from political life. As a child who became a woman to produce children for Islam, Shamima Begum literally embodied the gendered work that remains crucial to the making of childhood. But what other work does the coming together of the child and woman do? Greta Thunberg speaks of herself as a child in a generic and indeed conceptual fashion. Malala Yousafzai, on the other hand, was attacked by the Taliban because of her gender and apparent transvestitism in wanting to obtain a formal education. But whatever its cause, the large number of girls or young women to achieve visibility in public life merits attention. Does their gender allow such figures to double down on and dramatize the contrast between those who can and cannot act politically? Or does it display the child's link to an older world of associations? I suspect that gender here works to emphasize not the child's status as a victim so much as the surprising power it exerts from outside politics and its typically masculine representatives. And in this way, women are pulled back to the world of children rather than representing their future adulthood and reproduction. One of the earliest children to receive global attention as an activist was Iqbal Masih, who, like Malala Yousafzai, was also from Pakistan. Surprisingly absent from the narrative of Yousafzai's life, given his similar fight for children to be in school rather than working long hours under duress, Masih had been put to work in a carpet weaving workshop at the age of 4 during the mid-1980s to pay off a loan by his impoverished parents. He managed to escape the brutal treatment meted out to him at the age of 10 on a second attempt and was helped by an organization dedicated to ending bonded labor. Masih then went to school and campaigned worldwide for the rights and education of children until he was shot dead at the age of 12. Very likely by an assassin from the carpet weaving industry, which depended upon child labor. Masih spoke from a future he had already suffered, having been deprived of a childhood and so forced into adulthood before his time. As with Yousafzai, but not Thunberg, it was this experience that constituted what was adult about him. Like other children in politics, he had to play the role of child as well as adult, while fighting to separate them in the lives of others. But unlike most of his peers, he invoked not the adult future of politics so much as the lost past of the child deprived of it and turned into a ghost. It should be clear by now that children from outside Europe and America, or at least from minority or non-white backgrounds, dominate the ranks of their peers in politics. Is this because non-Western societies are seen as being more violent in making victims and so untimely adults out of children? Or might it be the case that Greta Thunberg and others, including the children who followed her in striking for the cause of climate change at school, have inherited their curious role in politics from the erstwhile third world in theory, if not experience? The prospective politics of children in the West was on display in September 2020 when 4 Portuguese minors and 2 young adults took 33 countries to the European Court of Human Rights for their carbon emissions, as well as the climate impact that consumers and companies have on people elsewhere. The only situation that comes to mind of children in the West speaking from a notionally adult experience as activists rather than actual or potential victims was during 2018 in the aftermath of a series of school shootings in the United States. These included protests, lions, and a movement to have companies divest from the gun lobby represented by the National Rifle Association that mobilized hundreds of students and many schools under the sign of March for Our Lives and the National School Walkout. As with all American responses to school shootings, however, these could not be sustained. Yet it is only very recently that children in the West have been able to take on a public role of this kind, being confined previously to playing those of victims, entertainers, and, with a longer genealogy, monarchs or fighting and martyred saints like Joan of Arc. In a familiar move, however, it is the European Thunberg who represents a universal and global cause for whose prosecution she must address politicians and people in the West. For as she makes clear in her speeches, it is they who are responsible for the climate crisis in both senses, as its primary perpetrators as well as potential opponents by reason of the wealth and power they possess. Her Asian peers, by way of contrast, speak to issues seen as being particular to the world beyond the West. And it is our inability to fit someone like Shamima Begum into either of these worlds that, apart from her association with the violence of the Islamic State, makes her such a difficult subject to deal with. For the threat of militant Islam is that it cannot be confined to specific groups of people or parts of the world, and so puts into question the division of the globe and its politics into universal and particular types. If the future and so politics speaks more urgently through children in the world outside the West, this may be due to the fact that since colonial times, such places have represented the sites of child marriage, child labor, and the loss of childhood more generally. Yet these children had in the past rarely escaped the status of victims and seldom played any role in politics apart from as an issue to be debated by adults. Something seems to have changed globally on this front, so that the experience of Iqbal Masih no longer served to define him only as a victim, but allowed him access to a knowledge otherwise reserved for adults. Such experience now produces a knowledge that politics is meant to prevent children from possessing, and in doing so, of speaking from and for their future as adults. Perhaps it is the inability to demarcate separate realms for children and adults that has made this innovation possible outside the West, premised as it is on the desire to finally produce such demarcation. The child activist, in other words, desires to put down or transfer the burden of politics to others and is a self-canceling figure in this way. And yet these children also encourage each other to take on such roles, not least because their present-day representatives seem to understand that they cannot play these parts as adults and require successors to do so. In an essay contemplating her graduation from college and so looking back upon a childhood she can no longer claim, Malala Yousafzai describes this past as a time spent observing and judging the political failures of adults from the vantage point of someone unable to engage in politics. Yet this failure also resulted in the untimely experiences that fitted out her contemporaries and successors to take up adult burdens more effectively. I quote, "Yet we have long understood that a lot of work will fall on our shoulders. We watched while those in power failed to protect refugees and religious minorities, stop attacks on schools, ensure justice for Black and brown people, or even acknowledge that climate change exists. We have grown up knowing that the world we inherit will be broken. In many ways, we are more prepared for the current crisis because we have had a lot of practice fighting for change. I was 11 years old when I started advocating for girls' education in Pakistan, and 15 when the Taliban tried to kill me for speaking out." Close quote. The novel emergence of children in politics is not due to the loss of childhood in the compression of temporality made possible by some emergency, whether a civil war or natural disaster. Neither is it simply the consequence of social media and the making of a global audience with the triumph of neoliberalism after the Cold War. Crucial instead is the point I began this lecture with: the fact that children are the last remaining category of citizen barred from engaging in political life. This solitude has resulted from the universalization of modern politics, which is compelled to include more and more people into its logic, however hierarchically they may be situated within it. The instrumentality of such a politics based on making the future has also marginalized all other ways of claiming freedom, a role once played by religion as much as philosophy, to assume a near hegemonic power in social life. It is only in this situation that childhood assumes a new and negative power as the chief, if not only, form of life and citizenship that lies outside the logic of politics. On the one hand, then, children threaten to join their former partners among women, slaves, or the conquered and colonized when they take on public roles that entail significant political consequences. But on the other hand, they can only do so by reinforcing their status as political outsiders, and in doing so, putting into question the very logic they would like to direct in support of some cause. The public lives of children, I have suggested, are given meaning by a kind of temporal refraction in which they serve as occult mediums or even speak as ghosts in their own right. But the split and spectral subjects this produces for politics also presents it with an impasse. We have seen that one consequence of children speaking in the name of their adult selves is to stretch the future whose making defines politics so that it is no longer determined by the short-term projections of electoral cycles and even self-interest. This results in a sacrificial mode of parental action whose trusteeship repudiates self-interest as a category because its sacrifice is a permanent and structural condition rather than some temporary or emergency measure. Another consequence of the child's public life is the reversal of roles it makes possible. If it is children who must now represent the spirit of adulthood, then adults themselves have been turned into children in the process, there to take instruction on their true selves. Apart from fragmenting the political subject in this way, such a situation dispenses with its generational reality to make it a concept freed of biology. Greta Thunberg describes a number of such reversals in the diary of her trip to the US and back to Europe in 2019. She appears to be struck by the self-infantilizing character of American citizenship, whose insouciance about health and environmental concerns comes directly from corporate marketing and the image it sells of quotidian life in a democracy. And I quote, "Who is the adult in the room?" That question has been asked over and over again during the last year. But this question reaches a whole new level when I end up standing in front of the food court in the US House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Fast food chains, hamburgers, candy and ice cream stores, Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin Robbins. Here you find the most powerful policymakers in the world sitting in their suits while drinking pink milkshake, eating junk food and candy, close quote. It is as if the spectral characters released onto the political stage by children without voices of their own make for a play of impersonations. Or better still, they turn the old categories of political life into roles that can be occupied by people of any age or gender. In itself, this is not a new phenomenon, since political representation too involves role playing given its theatrical origins. But more apposite is the theater of devotion, in which a divine being not only takes human form, but is celebrated by believers who in turn take on the roles of those who had known such sacred figures. The Imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, is one example of this, where it is not only Jesus himself, but all those around him who become models for Christian emulation or identification. It is not accidental that the first such models are Mary, Joseph, and other adults who witnessed his birth and childhood. The same can be said for the commemoration of Imam Hussein's martyrdom with the Shia, a tragedy that is foreshadowed even in his childhood and includes children among its eventual victims. And then there is the story of Krishna, who not only plays at being a child, lover, and warrior, but encourages his devotees to perform the roles and feel the wonderment, passion, or joy of his foster mother, childhood friends, lovers, or disciples in a lila, or blissful playing of the kind children are chiefly meant to enjoy. Children are crucial in all these practices of impersonation, in other words, whose identifications involve the switching of gender, generation, and other biographical characteristics. By enabling this form of impersonation, children in public life liberate political roles from biology in a way that the freedom or political inclusion of women, slaves, and others has never managed to do. Much more than mere empathy and far removed from political representation, such a play of roles involves not just temporary and ritualized forms of identification, but importantly, a disruption of temporality itself. Allowing for time travel, it takes the present into the past while projecting the latter into the future. And it is the shaking up of linear time that robs adults of the biological distinction upon which their political status is based, allowing women, children, and slaves to haunt the roles whose loss of biographical integrity have turned them into concepts or categories more faithful to political thought than the kind of citizenship that is still defined by free and adult males who belong to specific social groups. It is in such ways as these that children, along with all those who continue to lack political voice, nevertheless make a ghostly appearance in public life. In her reflections on graduating from Oxford in the midst of a pandemic, and therefore of being robbed, like all her peers, of a generational milestone different from the childhood she had once lost, Malala Yousafzai goes on to list the names of young women like herself who had as children also become activists in public life. Refusing their exceptionality by sheer dint of listing their growing numbers, Yousafzai is able to detach both children and therefore adults too from any biological fixity and even reverse their accepted roles in chiding the latter for their scant participation in political life. I quote, Lysipriya Kangujam was only 7 when she challenged politicians in India for their failure to enact climate change laws. 11-year-old Naomi Wadler quieted a crowd of thousands at the 2018 March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C., when she urged them to remember Black girls and women affected by gun violence. After her family fled Somalia's civil war, Hamdia Ahmed spent the first 7 years of her life in a refugee camp. By the time she was a teenager, she was campaigning for displaced people everywhere. And of course, there's my friend Greta Thunberg. I'm often asked to give advice to children, and I tell them, you don't have to wait to be an adult to be a leader. Young people are leading, but our world has too many problems for one generation to solve. So today my advice is for our elders. It's not too late for you to change. Close quote. Instead of children having to wait to enter politics and behave like adults, then it is now adults who are told they still have time to do so by imitating their own children. As with Hamlet, the ghost has taken precedence over the flesh and blood man who must now do his bidding by following the course of justice, morality and sacrifice, rather than self-interest. And in doing so, of course, the politics adults are asked to conduct departs from itself and turns into its opposite. Now I'm coming to my conclusion. To my knowledge, Gandhi is the only modern thinker to have foregrounded the role of children in moral and political life. And he did so precisely by attending to the child as a figure, much like the animal in this respect, which possesses no future in its own right. In his 1928 commentary on an ancient Sanskrit text called the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi argued that children and slaves represented ideal moral subjects. In doing so, of course, he overturned conventional notions of moral perfection, for which free and adult males were understood as subjects of this kind because of their independence, knowledge, and serious investment in shaping the future. But for Gandhi, these very characteristics were what disqualified men from exercising moral and even political agency, while admirably suiting children for it. It was precisely because children and slaves depended upon others, whether masters, parents, or teachers, that they could and indeed had to live in the present without any thought of making the future. This allowed them to grasp the present with far more gravity than adults, for whom it was always being sacrificed for some vision of the future in acts of instrumental violence that were nevertheless unable to achieve their aims with any certainty. And even if the future being planned in this way did end up coming about, Gandhi thought that it could never escape the violence of its birth, and in addition, brought along with it any number of unforeseen consequences, which gave rise to new problems and so invariably undermined the moral and political foundation it was intended to provide. By pressing so assiduously to achieve only very specific ends, the violent instrumentality of politics was both idealistic and therefore eventually self-destructive. Children and slaves, however, by inhabiting the present more fully than others and giving their acts a moral meaning in its terms, were unwilling to sacrifice the present for the future and instead able to do the reverse in prizing virtuous means over desired ends. And this meant that they left the future open to a number of possible ends, whose goodness was guaranteed by the very virtue of their means. This, Gandhi thought, was a far more realistic and even pragmatic way of behaving, one that made place for the incalculable in political life, if only so as not to be destroyed by it. While he did not approve of slavery, of course, Gandhi paired slaves with children not only in a reference to their historical association, but very deliberately in order to turn the traditional ideal of masculine independence on its head. His understanding of slavery as a form of experience leading to freedom also bears comparison to Hegel's famous passage on the master-slave dialectic in the Phenomenology of Spirit. There, too, it was the slave's laborious grappling with an obdurate world in the present that eventually allowed him to surpass what had become the master's purely ideal domination of it. But where Hegel's dialectic was nothing if not historical, seeking to push history into the future, for Gandhi, the present remained the site of moral action overshadowing politics. By focusing on the present in actions deprived of instrumentality, children and slaves were able to let the future emerge without trying to predetermine it in a violent idealism. And without this urge to make the future, violence exercised in the present would not be perpetuated in it. This made every moment of the future another present, as if in an instantiation of Bishop Berkeley's theory about the non-existence of the external world in a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. Yet in a history made up of an innumerable series of presents, politics necessarily took second place to morality if it did not entirely wither away. Gandhi tied the future making of politics to what he called modern civilization, by which he meant a world defined by the addiction to consumption that characterized industrial capitalism. And he seemed to think that it could be halted by social relations organized along other lines. Let us take a closer look at Gandhi's ideal child, whom he most frequently described in the mythological figure of Prahlad. The son of a demon king who unsuccessfully subjected him to a variety of tortures because of his virtue, Prahlad eventually brought about his father's death by praying to Vishnu for deliverance. The king had received a boon which prevented him from being killed by man or beast, indoors or out, by day or night, or by anyone born of a woman. One dusk, while boasting of his invulnerability to Prahlad, the king kicked one of the pillars of his palace walls, daring Vishnu to appear. The pillar split open, and out of it emerged Vishnu as half man, half lion, and proceeded to tear the demon apart. Now, why would Gandhi choose this graphically violent story of a parricide as much as a deliverance to illustrate his ideal of childhood? The story of Prahlad is one of sacrifice, but unlike biblical and other monotheistic narratives, in which it is the child who must be sacrificed by a parent, as in the story of Abraham and Isaac, here the situation is reversed. This makes the child into the primary moral agent rather than a potential, even if consenting, victim. Yet Prahlad doesn't actually perform the sacrifice himself or take any part in it. All he does is endure his father's torments and pray to Vishnu. In this way, he focuses entirely on virtuous deeds in the present and does not even consider the future that generally gives sacrifice its meaning. The fact that Vishnu appears at a moment of timelessness while occupying no particular place or species sets aside all the regular coordinates of human action. And this plays into Gandhi's vision of salvation as the incalculable element in moral and political life, one he often described as the incarnation of Vishnu on earth. Gandhi's ideas may well owe something to the cultural logic manifested in stories like that of Prahlad, which was well known to his Indian audience. But the emergence of children in contemporary politics, albeit outside its logic, also presents us with the kind of possibility that Gandhi had already espied in their name. For while in Iqbal Masih, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and even Shamima Begum might push for a certain kind of adult future in old-fashioned political terms, they can only do so from a time and place beyond its instrumentality. And it has been their time, and it has been their more or less inadvertent questioning of such a politics that I have tried to show has made them into global figures. Perhaps the Mahatma was right after all, and we can inherit the future primarily in moral terms, for which it is children who will have been our prophets. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm starting my video again. Thank you, Faisal, for that wonderful talk. Mary, I would like to hand over to you without further ado.
Thank you. First of all, my apologies for disappearing like that. I assure you I had no active part to play in it. I hope it won't happen again. It is very much both an honor and a pleasure to respond to this wonderful talk, The Childhood of Politics by Faisal Devji. It is one of those talks that pulls us, adults all, into the past, present, and future of our world taken as a whole, and does so from the paradoxical location of children in contemporary political thought. I do not need to repeat the many ways that Devji has evoked this impossible figure of the child in Western political theory, excluded from citizenship, yet one that has become the ghost in a time out of joint, calling upon adults to reconsider their fundamental interests in order to make a different future possible. My short response here is confined by what I may simply call the politics of childhood. And I think the title, The Childhood of Politics, is a play precisely on this very relationship. The figure of the child, as Devji repeatedly points out, is the last in a long list, from those without property, slaves, the colonized, and women, to have been denied a place in Western political life. We are all aware of the founding of modern Western political rights and its sleight of hand, speaking the language of universal rights while actually only granting them to white propertied men at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, led by France. In France itself, women only gained the right to vote in 1944. Devji points out that the child is no biological figure and refers in passing to the invention of childhood made famous by Philippe Ariès. Aris was a demographer, and much of his ideas came from the field of art, not political theory. Perhaps, and this is just a suggestion I have, the work of a historian, I'm thinking here of the work of Holly Brewer, would be more directly helpful. She has shown how it was precisely the emergence of the age of reason that was responsible for the disqualification of children for the first time in history. Religion, philosophy, and of course, liberal political theory all played their part in the shift from concerns of status and rank, where age did not matter, to this new time when children, along with others, were excluded from exercising authority by virtue of being unable to exercise reason and therefore consent. This shift was, moreover, a site of extreme and ongoing struggle. The late 20th century has been the arena where this struggle has been continuing, and this is my notion of the politics of childhood, where both adults and children have been engaging in the politics of childhood, such that children now exercise certain rights, but not citizenship. These are variously rights of protection as well as of empowerment. Moreover, this is also terrain where streams of scholarship and related forms of activism, notably psychological notions of child development, theories of the social construction of childhood, and feminist interventions have been reshaping the figure of the child, turning it increasingly into conflicted terrain. I was particularly fascinated by the principal protagonists in Devji's talk, namely Greta Thunberg and Malala Yousafzai. These are modern girls, or more precisely, modern adolescent girls. So I wonder, is this accidental? Of all the inventions and reinventions of childhood, it is the 20th century invention of adolescence that has seen the most complete of transformations. From having been a modern quote-unquote disease of industrializing societies at the beginning of the 20th century, adolescence has become normalized as the phase of the greatest possible promise in the hands of the latest scientific theories in the early 21st century, especially when it came to their intellectual potential. Legally and in international covenants on the rights of the child, these ideas have been reworked as evolving capacities. And in the hands of a very powerful and very adult white man, such as Lawrence Summers of the World Bank and many others who followed him, adolescent girls are nothing less than the solution of the problems of the developing world, provided, of course, that they now become the subjects of quote-unquote investment by first world international aid and corresponding client third world governments. So my response to Devji's talk, which opened up so many fresh questions for exploration and on a world scale, is to wonder whether his notions around the childhood of politics would not benefit through conversations with the politics of childhood, some of whose elements I have so briefly evoked. For instance, what happens when a figure like Greta Thunberg is marked as one such precocious adolescent, one moreover whose autism, an extraordinarily high-functioning version, cannot be left out of the picture? Or how is a figure like Malala invariably caught within the snares of neoliberal development thought that cannot go beyond granting her agency through education? And why, as Devji himself wonders, are these female figures? My own research on child marriage would suggest that the child woman / woman child of yesteryear has been among the most powerful figures of modernity across the globe and is now being symbolized through such figures of girlhood. Finally, a response to Devji's concluding thoughts centered on Gandhi and the figure of Prahlad. I sensed a tension between this section and the earlier parts of the paper. In the main paper, Devji talks in passing about how the very instrumentality of modern politics has not just marginalized children along with slaves, women, and the colonized, but has also, and I'm quoting, has also marginalized all other ways of claiming freedom, a role once played by religion as much as philosophy to assume near hegemonic power in social life, close quote. I feel this one sentence could be the subject of volumes of writing. Is Gandhi perhaps one of those thinkers who did not marginalize religion from social life? And is this how we should read his evocation of the violent story of Prahlad? Otherwise, Prahlad, popularly known as Bhakta Prahlad, does not quite fit the narrative of highly agential and irreverent children like Thunberg and Yousafzai, since his action is one of pure devotion to a higher power rather than one of talking back to the adult world in ways that make children out of adults. Of course, Devji is more interested in seeing Gandhi as someone who saw the potential in the figure of the child as a model moral force, as few other adult thinkers have sought to do. That much can be granted. However, at least when it comes to gender and caste, I wonder whether we may have to think as much against the thought of someone like Gandhi as with him. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Those are really wonderful comments. I don't know the work of Holly Brewer, but I'm certainly going to look it up.
Please.
And I just, may I, Lilac, respond, or do you want me to?
No, of course, please do respond.
Yeah, so just the three major points you made, Mary. The age of reason, of course, that's exactly right. And as you were speaking, I was recalling also Foucault's Madness in Civilization, which deals with exactly this problem, doesn't it? You know, what does the privileging of reason, what consequences does it have for all those who are assumed not to have it? The child is one such figure, and of course, Foucault is concerned with the person of with the category of figures understood as being mad or insane, and as it were, ethical quandary of his work has to do with how might you represent them in a work of scholarship while at the same time refusing to have them speak in a necessarily reasonable way, and therefore have them simply included in the very categorizations that the age of reason makes possible. And this indeed, I guess, is the primary contradiction, is it not? That is true also of what you say about Gandhi. And it's one that is rehearsed, I think, by the figure of the child. So if the child is the only figure left who ostensibly has no political voice, all the others, women, the colonized, the enslaved, notionally at least, having been added to the other side, to the side of reason, as it were, having been endowed with or gifted with or presumed to have reason and therefore political voice, it's the very solitude of the child, I argue, that really makes that space outside the space of voice, as I put it, or reason, as you urge us to think about it, and as Foucault writes about, so important. So in a way, my paper is also about the curious power exerted by the remnant, by the one left outside. And precisely because the child is the only one left outside, it can exert this kind of power without ever joining those who have been placed now in a subordinate form, albeit within the realm of marked by voice in my language, or reason in the language you cite. But this also goes to your second point about adolescence, also very important. And what really struck me is how, whether it is Thunberg or Yousafzai, or to some degree even Shamima Begum, even though a lot of the claims made about the last one in particular have to do with sexuality, adolescence, etc., reproduction, there was a kind of countervailing discourse of childhood. So the self-presentation of all of these young women as being either now or at some time in the recent past children, speaking as children, that's what I found fascinating, because it's not a sleight of hand, to use the phrase you use, because but rather I think it's not simply a rhetorical strategy. I think it's a way of freeing the figure of childhood from its biological specificity, So it really functions as a political category of political thought. And in a way, perhaps inadvertently, it's a way of, it allows these young women to grasp what the work that that figure is doing in political thought by laying claim to the status of the status of childhood, and therefore placing themselves outside deliberately. Whereas had they spoken in the name of adolescence or young adulthood, to use another term, then we would have been part of a equally interesting but different discussion. Because think of the term adolescence or young adult. It's a curious threshold term again. Unlike the figure of the child, it doesn't seem to have an absolute ontological or phenomenological distinction. It's about transition. And that makes for a different set of questions, I think. Very interesting to open up. The fact that they don't do it is what strikes me as being interesting, that you constantly return to the figure of the child. The person of the young adult or the adolescent, I agree with you, would be very, very interesting to talk about, not least because, as you point out, that is the site of the greatest political tension and indeed mobilization in our own day. When you think of militias and when you think of protests and demonstrations and or awful things, rapes, etc., etc. So that whole world of political violence is dominated by this figure, the transitional figure of the adolescent or the young adult, very often. But that would require an entirely different treatment. So I just want to acknowledge that. And thirdly, Gandhi, yes, of course, I deliberately describe Prahlad, the story of Prahlad, precisely because it is so violent, to show the ambiguity and the problematic nature of Gandhi's narrative here. And I suspect he was all too aware of it himself. So on the one hand, yes, he's very interesting as a thinker because he's one of the few who privilege the child and indeed the slave, and try to think of a world of moral action which is not entirely defined by the instrumentality of sacrificing means for ends, and therefore is not future oriented in that particular way. On the other hand, I think what's interesting about Prahlad and the sacrifice that he represents is that not only does it stand counter to the, as it were, the sort of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim vision of the sacrifice of Isaac, with sacrifice of the child, and therefore, in some curious way, the sacrifice of a future, a potential sacrifice of a future. Here, it is the sacrifice of the father, of the past, that is important. And I suspect for Gandhi, of course, because Gandhi was so keen on the fact that one must begin with the sacrifice of one's own. And that is also a lesson he takes from the Gita, where Arjuna is told by Krishna, of course, you must fight your own relatives and preceptors and friends on the Kaurava, on the side of the Kauravas, precisely because they are close to you and because they are related to you. You can only begin by sacrificing your own, not someone else. And so I take Gandhi's focus on Prahlad to be in part about that idea of the intimacy of sacrifice. But a lot might be said about what it means to sacrifice the past in the figure of the father, and whether this kind of sacrifice bears any similarity to the kind of Republican sacrifice that Carol Pateman talks about, where you must, since you mentioned revolutionary France, where the king as the figure of the father must be beheaded in order for the sons to take power in a fraternity, in a Republican fraternity, where it is again the masculine figure of the brother who dominates, and who then in turn serves as a trustee for women, children, etc., etc. So there's a kind of strange way in which the figure of the patriarch is beheaded only for the son to take his place, and in a realm of brotherhood, serve as a trustee figure for those lower down in the hierarchy. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for these really wonderful comments.
There are a lot already. There's already a large number of questions, and we've exceeded the time frame. If you don't mind, we could actually have 10, 15 more minutes. I'm starting with a question by Yasmin Arif, and she asks, the special court at Sierra Leone added children conscription as the new crime against humanity. This is a political and jurisdictional making of a legal form of life. This could be trusteeship and victimhood, but is this not about childhood per se? Or and later she added a comment that this is perhaps a little more about the future of childhood rather than only as future of a child. Maybe another form beyond the ghost and the medium. It will be great to hear your thoughts. Would you like to reply immediately, or shall I just pick out some more questions?
Whatever you think would be best. I don't mind.
Well, then I think I just pick out two more questions, and then we could continue. And there is a question by Joseph Prabhu. Is it right on the part of the organization to make children to participate in public protest on the rights issues of children or issues which may affect their future life? And
sorry, could you repeat that? I was just writing down the previous one. So,
is it right on the part of the organization to make children to participate in public protest on the rights issues of children or issues which may affect their future life? Then there is one question by Tanu Bismas. So first, she thanks you very much for your talk. And she's an interdisciplinary philosopher of education, theorizing through the lens of childism. Currently, I'm writing about school strikes, and your talk resonates with my current work very much. My first question is, how do you think a trusteeship model of democracy would look like? My second question is, never before has there been a generation that began striking at such a large scale before they began voting. At the same time, school strikes have been met with a strong opposition because children have a duty to be in school. Given their lack of access to formal democracy, should a right to strike be extended to include children?
Great, thanks very much. I imagine the first question, the making illicit of the recruitment of children has to do with the narrative of the child soldier in West Africa in particular. And, you know, that really is an interesting phenomenon because it too puts into question the usual divisions and distinctions we make between childhood and adulthood, loss of voice and loss of voice and ownership of voice, and brings to the fore all of these other issues about on spectrality and haunting, you know, outside influence, grooming, forcible conscription, etc., etc. So that's, I take that countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, etc., as being providing a site for these kinds of questions that I raised in the paper, which are exercised and exorcised, if you will, through the figure of the so-called child soldier, as opposed to other kinds of figures. The ones that are closest, if you will, in comparison, of course, are the so-called jihadi brides like Shamima Begum I was talking about, or other sort of child figures fighting in militant groups in the Middle East. I don't think that, to my knowledge, there is, how should I put it? I'm sure there are very many nuances around these questions raised in West Africa. The prescription on recruitment is interesting because it seems to resemble similar kinds of prescriptions. For instance, a prescription of the employment of children, child labor laws, or the prescription of marriages to children, or in all of these things that are well known, some of which go back to the 19th century, others of which are more recent. So I would place that within the same logic, and only by saying that in a novel like Amadou Kourouma has this wonderful novel called Allah n'est pas obligé, which is precisely the narrative of a child soldier in West Africa. And it's a wonderful picaresque novel which doesn't shy away from the brutality and violence of this the period of civil war in this part of the world, but in which, as I take it, the problem is precisely the reversal of ontological categories that occurs in such a situation when children become soldiers or children take on the role of adults. It immediately makes adults into children. And so there's this topsy-turvy world that's created in this picaresque novel, where it's the figure of the child soldier who, while remaining a child, appears to be more adult in all kinds of ways, obviously in experience, but also in terms of his deployment of, to go back to marry, reason, compared to the adults, including his uncle, who is a sorcerer. So it is the adults in this novel who are, as it were, imbued with magical thinking, because their politics is so restricted to the very narrow temporal parameters of self-interest that it can have no meaning beyond them. And in this context, it is the child whose focus on the immediate present actually, in Gandhian terms, ends up being more adult. As far as the mobilization, the second question, the mobilization of children, the forcible mobilization of children for rights, that too is a long-standing debate, and I can only cite, for instance, a very controversial milestone in such a debate, which is Hannah Arendt's famous essay on Little Rock, in which she castigates Black parents, African-American parents, for putting their children into white-dominated schools in order to make the desegregation of schooling possible. And her argument is, how can you treat your own children in this manner? How can you instrumentalize your children by putting them through this? So in making that argument, which of course, and obviously is a very problematic one, right? Because is Hannah Arendt therefore saying that you shouldn't have any active role in desegregation, or suggesting that children should not be on the front line of it precisely because they have no voice? Parents must act as the trustees and therefore cannot act through them. Her point is parents acting through their children by putting them on the front lines. I think this question of the mobilization of children and their instrumentalization by adults is one that has a longish history. And if we take the Hannah Arendt essay as one of its classical sites of enunciation, then I think all of these things that I try to bring up in my lecture get rehearsed again in different ways than I've done so. But the instrumentality, spectrality, sacrificing the present for the future, sacrificing the future, the child itself, for the adults present. So in all of these cases, time really does, as it were, goes out of joint in the sort of Shakespearean, in the way that Hamlet specifies it. and you have a kind of strange coming together or mixture of past, present, and future, of role changing and of impersonation, because it is the child in the Aaron story who must forcibly play the part of the adult, with the adult somehow behind, right? So I take that as being a kind of nice illustration of some of the problems that I try to raise in my lecture. As far as the third question is concerned about trusteeship, now I use that term deliberately because, of course, it is also associated with Gandhi. Gandhi thinks that trusteeship is what should characterize the behavior of big capitalists and of landowners. So he doesn't want, with the independence of India, to expropriate these figures. He wants them to become trustees of their own property for the sake of the poor. Now, obviously, and even in Gandhi's own day, people laughed at this as being simply a thinly veiled excuse to keep these categories of wealth and to protect these categories, keep them in place and protect them. But Gandhi was referring specifically to the trust, the charitable trust in British law, which of course was also part of Indian law, where wealth has been given over for a specific charitable purpose, and the trustee is there to ensure that that purpose is fulfilled. So the trustee certainly has power because the trustees collectively decide how this wealth is to be dispersed, but cannot make use of that wealth on his or her own, or for his or her own sake, however much influence he or she exercises in allocating it. So I suppose trusteeship too is an entirely problematic term, and I use it problematically. I take it from Gandhi primarily, though it's not obviously a Gandhian term specifically. And I problematize it by suggesting that that indeed is the liberal model for thinking about the future of children, that adult is put in the position of a trustee. There is certainly an interesting set of possibilities that position opens up, as the charitable trust itself does, but it doesn't really make it outside the system of liberal political thought. It simply creates a kind of space within it for a set of actions that are not determined by self-interest, in my view. So what interested me about trusteeship was how it, as it were, neutralized the logic of self-interest that is normally meant to characterize politics and the political actions of adults in particular. So what I would suggest is that trusteeship creates an opening within a system. It doesn't actually overturn that system and isn't able to, as it were, operate outside it. That possibility still remains, in my view, in the realm of childhood as a remnant of a past which has apparently been overcome. That's where the power of standing outside derives precisely from the non-liberal or the illiberal past.
Thanks a lot. I don't know, I think there are so many wonderful questions that I received, but I think we should stop here after we're already 15 minutes late. And our sincerest thanks to you, Faisal, for that great lecture, and to Mary, of course, for the brilliant discussion of the talk, and for all the attendees. And I'm truly sorry that we can't answer more questions right now. I mean, we've now learned. I thought we should probably schedule these virtual lectures a bit shorter, but there might be exceptions to that, normal guideline. So many thanks again, and this will certainly not be the last ICAS and Peace special lecture online, and we'll all keep you updated. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.